Hey Nathan, how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you very much.
I'm really excited to have you on today because containers is one of those things that, man, there is a lot of content out there. So I'm happy to have you to teach me more about it and to teach our folks joining us here as well. So
Yeah, I've
before
been
we
a,
jump
a developer advocate for containers for about 5 years now. So I've kind of seen it from the early phases of like AWS just starting to get into containers, and now to the just explosion of so many different ways to talk about containers. And excited to talk about how you can get into it and start learning that.
Yeah, no, that's great. So I'm so glad we have you as the expert. But for those of the folks joining that are new to the show or haven't seen you as a host, can you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us more about what we're going to learn today?
Yeah, so I'm a developer advocate on the native AWS Container Services team. And so I'm focusing a lot on container services like Amazon Elastic Container Service, AWS Fargate, AWS App Runner, and really all of the ways to run containers serverlessly with the minimum amount of overhead and management. And we really let AWS handle as much of the stack as possible so that you can focus on building your application and enjoying the benefits of using a container.
Yeah, no, and that's really important. I hear that theme over and over is how do we reduce the churn for our builders so that they can build more and build quicker. So yeah, I'm excited to hear more.
Uh-oh. Looks like Marie might have frozen there.
Oh, am I back?
Yes, you are back. You're back.
Awesome. Yeah, this will be fun. Um, so could you tell me a little bit about why containers are so popular for developers now?
Yeah, sure thing. So I've seen containers really go from something that started out as a little bit experimental, people weren't sure whether they trusted it, to being an actual industry standard for how to package up your application and distribute it. And really, it's come down to a couple factors. The main factor, first of all, being just the experience of using a container. Prior to containers, I remember there were a lot of times when there was a challenge. There was a sort of distrust of whether or not if I built an application, it was going to work properly when I shipped it to production, because I have my local laptop and everything worked great when I coded it on my laptop. But then I realized there's a difference between the environment on production. Maybe there's a different version of my Node.js runtime, or I forgot to install the latest packages on that remote computer that I'm going to be running my application on. So containers came along as a tool that helps me define a repeatable recipe basically for how to build my
Hmm.
application, include all of the things that are necessary. And then I know that that application is going to be shipped from my developer machine all the way up to the cloud, and it's going to run the same way everywhere, including on my fellow coworkers' machines. So that alone was already like a huge benefit of containers. Um, and then the other aspect was containers provide this ability to actually run multiple applications side by side, even if they would otherwise conflict with each other. So a classic one would be I have some Python 2 and a Python 3 application, and I want to run them side by side. Or maybe I have a Node.js 12 and Node.js 14 application. And so ordinarily this would be challenging because if I try to run these applications side by side, they'll be conflicting each other. I have to do a really complex setup. With
Hmm.
containers, all these applications are separate from each other in their own little containerized boxes. And I can run them actually side by side on the same machine, on my laptop, on a server, and they're not going to conflict with each other. So it really opened up the door to saying, I have a lot more flexibility now. I can ship an application to production. I can run multiple versions of the application side by side, and it solves a lot of those developer experience problems.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that's music to my ears for someone like me who is very organized and needs to compartmentalize. So being able to not only live that way, but also develop that way, it's a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. I remember one of the things that I hated about deploying directly onto a host was when I would go to all the work to copy everything onto a server, like all my code, get a particular version installed on the server of maybe like Node.js or Python, and then that machine would break for some unknown reason, like a configuration would get messed up. and or maybe I made like a manual change to the configuration and I got things magically working, but then I couldn't figure out how to repeat that. I would
Yeah.
say, why is this machine different from that machine? Why is the application working here but not there? And so containers was a game changer for me because now I said, okay, I can take this container to the machine, put it on there. I can actually take it off and erase it, and it's completely gone, and the machine is reset and back to the baseline of how it started.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can't, yeah, that's, it's hard to imagine life before that for sure. Uh,
Yeah.
so for those folks, you kind of jumped into it a little bit, but for those folks watching that maybe haven't gotten into containers, why would one use it? We talked about making it kind of compartmentalizing a little bit, kind of being able to run different workloads at the same time. Are there any other things that are kind of the big draws to working with containers?
I think those are definitely the two main ones. But the third one that shouldn't be underestimated is just that it has become an industry standard. Um,
Hmm.
Lots of people across the industry are doing it. So if you are looking to hire developers and you say, well, we're just using this, like we're using an old school approach, they're going to be like, I don't know. I like working with containers. I want to work somewhere where they're still using containers to this day. So I think in many ways, like using containers has become a baseline expectation for,
Yeah.
okay, we're kind of doing the right things, and I know that this architecture is going to work out well.
Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, the more like week over week, it's just more and more about containers, and it's definitely an expectation of this industry these days. So yeah, obviously at AWS we have a lot of different options here. So what are some of the AWS services that can let me deploy containers, and how do I know which one to start using?
That's a good question. So I don't think any discussion of this topic would be complete without acknowledging the infamous Corey Quinn and his meme about there being 17 ways to run containers on AWS. And I think, like all good memes, it's based around a hard kernel or a seed of truth, which is that it's challenging. It's challenging to get into containers because there are so many different ways to run containers. And I think in some respects, what I like people to think is that that is a good thing. Like I said, because this is a standard for packaging and deploying an application, that means that I can use that same standard everywhere that I go to look to deploy code. And so, as many ways as there are to run code, there are actually ways to run containers. And so, when evaluating how to run my container, the things that I start to look at are more around what is my application? How do I want my application to work? So I start to think like, do I want a serverless model, or do I want to rent a server and pay a server? Do I want to pay per event or per request, or do I want to pay for a chunk of time and see how many requests and events I can stuff into that time? Um, and so really I start to look at the pricing model. I start to look at what events trigger the container to run.
Hmm.
Whether that's maybe merging code. I want to run the code as part of a pipeline, or I want to run the code in response to uploading an event on S3. Uh, and then I look at whether I want serverless or traditional VM. And
Yeah,
so there's
no,
a whole host of different services, right? Like there's AWS Fargate, AWS App Runner, and really, I think the best way to think about it is to think about use cases. Start from a use
hmm,
case, and then say, okay, which service is going to best fit that use case?
yeah, no, that's great. And yeah, and I love how you distilled that down for me, especially of how do we even start to look at this? And as someone that may be new to containers or just totally new to AWS, and want to start getting or to get started with containers, where would you recommend they start?
Okay, so I latched on to what you said there about new to AWS, and to me that right away says to me that Lightsail might be the best place to start. Lightsail is essentially a simplified AWS that's designed to have an API which is focused on the essentials of what you need without getting too deep into the networking and all of the complexities of the all of AWS. We know that AWS is a gigantic playground toolbox with a million features you can play with.
Hmm.
But you don't necessarily, when you're starting out, want to play with all those features. You just want to say like, okay, I want a smaller sandbox that has just a few things to start out with. And so I think Lightsail provides that. It provides a service called Lightsail Container Services. And the idea is you just upload your container and it gives you back a endpoint for your container. And it provides a predictable pricing model where it says, there's a flat
Mm.
rate for this size of container for the entire month, and some bandwidth is included. And it provides a fantastic place to get started with the essentials of learning. I think especially for folks that are learning to program currently, they're learning a language like Node.js, JavaScript, or Python,
Hmm.
and they don't necessarily want to learn the cloud on top of that at the same time. So
Yeah.
here you can focus on learning your programming language and how to code, and then layer on the infrastructure gradually as you need to.
Yeah, no, you're a great teacher. That's a really good recommendation for a ramp up plan of how to get there, and really just understanding the learning of the blocks there, the building blocks, and then also getting a touch into the cloud once you're ready for that. So, no, that's awesome. And also for folks joining, if you have any questions for Nathan specifically, feel free to put them in the chat. He'll be here answering your questions when we get to the end here. So please don't hesitate to pop those in there, and we'll try and get to them. But yeah, so one of the things you mentioned, Nathan, was really working backwards from your use case and or your application and what you're trying to do. But what if we look at it from, what if I have a startup or I have a small project and I'm just not sure, is this even going to be successful yet? Do I want to invest this time? What would your recommendation be there?
Okay, so I think that's a good one to start out with, because so many businesses do start there. Um, if you're not quite sure that you've reached product market fit yet, you've designed something and you have a gut feeling that it might become popular, or maybe it might even enjoy a brief burst of popularity. For example, I think
Hmm.
Wordle is like the classic example of that, right?
Yeah.
It felt like it blew up out of nowhere and was everywhere across the internet for a while, and then kind of enthusiasm dies down a little bit, and when you start to build an architecture for an application like that, it's a bit tricky because things can go so viral. They can start out
Hmm.
small, they can suddenly spike up to a tremendous number of users. But then if it doesn't maintain that, then you'll gradually ramp off and like go back down to low traffic again. So how can I design something that handles both of those? So the two services that come to mind right away for containers are AWS Lambda support for containers and AWS App Runner. And they're two very similar serverless models that can scale up and down seamlessly as you get more traffic and less traffic. And there are differences between the two. So AWS Lambda, I would choose that every time for an
Hmm.
application which starts out with almost next to no traffic, but could at any time receive like a huge viral spike of traffic. Because nobody, I think, can match AWS Lambda in terms of ability to
Yeah.
scale out horizontally to just thousands of small containers in a very short period of time. I absolutely love the service for that aspect. And additionally, it works really well for a service which is getting occasional traffic. So people are logging in, maybe it was like a minute or two between each request. I'm not paying for any of that time in between.
Hmm.
Now, as I sort of develop my service, though, I could reach a point where there is a decent amount of traffic, but there's also periods where there is very low traffic. And I think that's where AWS App Runner is optimized to fit. So the way AWS App Runner works is you pay for the time your container runs, you pay for the CPU and memory. But when your
Hmm.
application is not busy, like nobody's actually using the application, the container can actually go down to only charging for the memory and not charging for any CPU if there's no requests coming in. And so I think that provides like a good medium point between
Yeah.
I do want to serve a lot of requests for a very low rate when there is a period of burst of traffic. I just want to pay for a flat CPU and stuff like 1,000 requests per second onto that CPU. If I'm capable of doing that. But when there are no requests coming in, I'm only going to pay for the memory. And so those two serverless models, I think, provide good alternatives for saying, Here's something that can scale up, scale out automatically, and scale up really high. But then also scale down to the most minimal cost possible. With Lambda, it can scale all the way down to zero. With AWS App Runner, it can scale down to only charging you for memory and not charging for CPU at all.
Yeah, no, and that's a great example, and really awesome to hear the not only just using the CPU load, but also the cost saving. So obviously, if you're starting something new, you don't want to invest a ton up front. So that's a really great model. So I'm going to throw a fast one at you. So what if it was the opposite? What if I'm deploying a huge high traffic application? I know it's going to be huge. I know it's going to be high traffic. What are some of the steps I should take to make sure that that's successful?
Yeah. So when a service reaches a point where it's huge and there's really high traffic, one of the key things that comes to mind is what is my per request cost? Because if I've reached a point where I'm getting 1,000 requests per second, maybe even 10,000 requests per second from my customers, those requests start to add up really fast. And so that's where I start to say, what is a compute that I can use where I'm paying the lowest rate for a CPU, which is powerful and can serve many concurrent requests to my
Hmm.
customers at the lowest possible rate. But I also want it to be easy to manage. I don't want to have to manage my own hardware and stuff like that. And I think that's where AWS Fargate comes into play. And AWS Fargate is basically it's also serverless,
Hmm.
similar to Lambda, similar to App Runner, but the pricing model is once again the difference. With AWS Fargate, the pricing model is you pay a flat rate for CPU as long as the container runs. However, that flat rate can be really low. I can run Fargate Spot. I can run on Graviton instances. I can get these really
Yeah.
powerful Graviton 2 or Graviton 3 processors, which can process a lot of requests per second at a lower per request rate. So
Yeah.
now that one processor could be handling 1,000 requests per second, no problem. And my overall rate for the entire month of running that processor is going to be lower than if I was paying individually per request for 1,000 requests per second. And now the advantage there or disadvantage is I have to keep that processor busy myself. I have to make sure that
Yeah.
I'm constantly driving up traffic to it. And if there is a period in time where my traffic falls down and like people aren't really using my service, now I'm overpaying because I'm paying for a huge processor that can process thousands of requests per second, but I'm not actually using it.
Hmm.
So that's where that balance point comes. Where for large services, they will start to look at AWS Fargate. They may even start to look at Amazon Elastic Container Service on EC2
Yeah.
because then they can take advantage of picking their own CPU generation, their own EC2, and selecting a really large, powerful EC2 instance that can process 10,000 requests per second,
Yeah.
and keep that instance actually busy.
Yeah. No, definitely. No, this has been awesome. I did want to get to, we have a couple questions in the chat. I wanted to at least get to one. So this question's from Amanda D. What is the most interesting use case you've seen containers applied to slash within? And she's interested to see the functionality or the functional ambiguity of containers.
Interesting. So I've seen a lot of different use cases. I think probably one of the most interesting ones would be a startup that I was talking to, which I believe we actually featured on the show not too long ago. I don't remember the name of it though, unfortunately, off the top of my head. I have to look it up. But what they do is they do machine learning on email from actual school students to detect bullying, sexual harassment, and,
Oh, wow.
and suicidal threats. And this all happens behind the scenes, and they're able to alert parents or school administrators if childs are going through a crisis. And so they're actually able to save lives in the real world by finding out when students are going through these traumatic experiences and making sure that they get the help they need. And to me, that was such like a heartwarming thing that I
Hmm.
see machine learning being used for good. I see actual lives being saved. I was like, wow, I feel it's great to work on a system that deploys containers that help make this a reality.
Yeah, that's an incredible example. I love that, and yeah, it goes to show how tech can do. do things in big ways like we talked about, but also really get down to humanity and how we can help there. So awesome. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time together. I'm so sad. It's been so fun to to hang out, but kind of circling back. So kind of what if I wanted to learn all the 17 ways to run containers, kind of how you talked about that meme on AWS? What do I do? Where do I go? How do I get started?
Well, in reference to the meme, I would definitely recommend just search the 17 ways to run containers on AWS, because Corey Quinn has produced a fantastic article with his thoughts on those particular container services, and I agree with a lot of what he's written in there as to how he would evaluate and choose between these services. On the other hand, though, there's also a lot of workshops. So one of my favorite workshops to get started with is ecsworkshop.com, and it'll walk you through how to get started with Amazon Elastic Container Service, AWS Fargate. And the other tool that I like to recommend is AWS Copilot. It's a tool that we've built to be that starting point. They'll help you try out App Render. It'll help you try out AWS Fargate, ECS, and it's designed to have a low barrier to entry. So you can spend 5 minutes playing with this service, 10 minutes, 15 minutes playing with that service, and try them all out in parallel and see how it works out. And then
Yeah.
you can make your choice later.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. It's super helpful. Um, yeah, so thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you being on this first session as I get to hang out with this group and we get to learn a lot of things today. For all of you joining, in order to help us get you the content that you want and you need, we want to hear from you. So please take 5 minutes after the show to fill out a survey that we have. Fun fact, the first 50 respondents will get a $10 AWS credit. And there's a survey after each section. So there's a survey after Nathan's section, and there's a survey after the next session that we're going to have as well. So stay tuned. And then, Nathan, is there any final words that you want to leave with our folks here before we head to the next exciting thing?
Have fun with containers. Try them out. Let me know what you think. My Twitter handle's up there on the screen if you have any questions or anything I can help with. And otherwise, thank you for having me on the show.
Awesome. Thanks for joining.